Hi, welcome to session 2 of the fifth topic of the semester dealing with the First World War. Okay, so it's World War I from 1914 to 1918. So in this session, we're going to continue discussing the causes and origins of the war, and we're going to be moving also into the outbreak of the war itself. In this session, again, this is the continuation of looking at the causes, the origins of World War I, something we started in session 1. We were looking at Europe, the continent of Europe per se. One of the leading causes of World War I that we discussed in session 1 quite thoroughly was intense ethnic nationalism. Again, and we discussed that quite thoroughly because it serves the purpose for understanding not only World War I, but the 20th century itself, the significance of ethnicity, ethnic politics, as it became known, in the formation of nations, for example, in the independence of colonized groups who claimed their right to become independent, to form their own independent nation state, based on the fact that those colonized groups proclaim a certain ethnicity, they proclaim an ethnic identity, which went back many, many generations into the past. And again, we saw how the concept of ethnicity is going to be highly central to the struggles of peoples demanding rights, demanding independence, demanding the right to vote, forming their own independent nation states represented by members of their own group, so they could elect leaders coming from their own particular group who will understand the group, understand the culture, the language, the values, the traditions of that particular ethnic group. So again, I provided a very extensive analysis of ethnicity and self-determination. Again, those two concepts that were central in the formation of European nation states, because this is something that will enable us to understand the 20th century in general. Many of the struggles of the 20th century were also ethnic struggles as well, that we're going to see down the road in future topics. And so, again, it kind of provided the groundwork for understanding the future of this class, the future of the semester, in terms of the kind of topics, the type of issues that we're going to be dealing with, particularly in the 20th century. So, European nations are arising in the 19th century based on this concept. Again, that Europe, the peoples of Europe began to become increasingly divided along ethnic lines. They saw themselves separated along ethnic lines, thinking that there was a multiplicity of different ethnic groups in Europe that were moving now towards nationhood. Okay, they were transforming their political institutions, their kingdoms, their monarchies now into nation states. And in this process, we're going to see the formation of ethnic states or ethno-states. And there's many ways of saying this, ethno-states. So the European nations were actually ethnic communities that were forming their own state, that are going to have constitutions, they're going to have laws that reflected the values of that particular ethnic group. With a representative form of government that is going to represent the group as well. You know, people are going to elect their leaders, and etc. But in this process, what the Europeans are going to do is, because they needed to create national unity, they needed to bring people together to support their own nations. They started really building a version of the past in order to glorify the forerunners in order to glorify the founders of the group, their ancestors, as superhuman. Okay, that really, again, created the sense of nationalism. Again, people began to feel very, proud about their nation because they felt that this nation represented a very special ethnic group that went back hundreds, if not thousands of years into the past, going back to mythical ancestors, that their ancestors were not ordinary human beings. They were superhuman. In other words, they created supernatural feats. They, great works of art, great works of architecture. They were great rulers, leaders, etc. So because they were glorifying their past in order to provide, again, a sense of nationalism, this is going to exacerbate, of course, the competition among the European groups, because each group believed to be very special, more special than the others, because each group glorified their own ancestors, their own past, in order to exalt the group and see that their ethnic group was superior. So this created, again, a sense of tribalism, if you will, in which people saw that their tribe was superior, stronger, better than the others. Okay, so again, this is very important, in order to understand the outbreak of World War I, because this, again, created a sense of tribalism, dividing Europeans along tribal lines, that over time, by 1914, this is going to create, again, a conflict, okay, warfare, tribal warfare in the 20th century. Okay, now let us move forward then to look at the other causes for World War One. Okay, so we covered, quite thoroughly ethnicity and ethnic nationalism as one of the leading causes. But as we move now into other causes, we're now going to assess other types of factors that are more materially based. They're not necessarily ideological. This is not, again, an idea, like nationalism is an idea, ethnicity is an idea, by the way. But there were other reasons that Europeans are going to fight for, and those are more practical, more material things that they deem essential for their own nation. For example, when we look at the second root cause of World War One, one of the most widely studied, again, causes for World War One is what is called European colonialism. So what this means is that the Europeans who declare war on each other and went to war with one another in 1914 were all of them, without exception, all of them were imperial powers that had developed colonies in different parts of the world, colonies that served the country economically because of the kind of resources that that particular country extracted from that particular colony. And what we're going to see is by 1914 that the Europeans are going to compete with each other over those colonies, and they were trying to obtain the colonies of the other party. Okay, and so this is a colonial competition. In other words, they were competing over colonies, colonial possessions, territories that were highly valuable for their own national economies, and they deemed necessary that this is necessary because in order for the nation to thrive, to survive economically, we need those resources. So we need to compete again with the other side. We're going to look at which alliances, which Europeans are going to come together against the other alliance. Again, we're going to see the systems of alliances again just shortly. But here it is important to understand European colonialism. Okay, this is nothing new. Particularly when we look at 1914 or even the 19th century, European colonialism, the idea that Europe had developed a system of colonial territories, colonial possessions in different parts of the world, really go back centuries in the past. with the discovery of America, particularly by Columbus in 1492, what we're going to see is that the Europeans are beginning to step outside of their own borders in Europe, and they're beginning to sail around the world and colonize different regions of the world, starting with the American continent. Again, the American continent will be colonized by a series of European kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Portugal, Spain, later on by France, the Dutch, the British are going to establish a series of colonies that it took centuries, again, to build. From the 1500s all the way to 1750, what we see is that during this process of colonization, this is the kind of the first stage of European colonization. The Europeans are building colonies in overseas lands. Again, particularly in the American continent, we're going to see the American continent being carved out into a series of colonial territories claimed by different European powers, which during this time, the purpose of those colonies in America was to generate agricultural products, particularly what the Europeans were doing, again, in the Americas. When they established those colonies, was establishing, for the most part, plantations, okay? Agricultural enterprises like plantations in order to grow cash crops that were worth gold and silver, in order to export them around the world. So this gave rise then in Europe to a series of agricultural empires. Okay, the kind of empires that existed during this time in Europe when they were establishing colonies in America, those were agricultural empires, because it was really agricultural products that were the source of revenues, the source of wealth for those European kingdoms that were extracting, of course, those crops, those resources out of the Americas, and pretty much selling them around the world. So it took about 2.5 centuries, again, for European colonialism to flourish, and it was an agricultural imperialism, if you will, okay, type of imperialism. But European colonialism is going to change significantly starting around 1750, and it acquired a different character, a different nature. And we're going to see that Europeans are going to transform their empires from agricultural empires into industrial empires. The reason is simple, is that by 1750, we see the beginning stages of the Industrial Revolution. Again, we covered that, quite, thoroughly in a previous topic. The Industrial Revolution begins in England, began to spread into different parts of the world, particularly in Western Europe, Holland, Germany, France. The Industrial Revolution also occurred in the United States, but also Japan, again, is going to industrialize. But when we talk about Europe, okay, just exclusively in Europe, what we see is that the Europeans are now in need of colonial territories, not necessarily to grow cash crops, necessarily, okay? Even though cash crops are still valuable, things like cotton, for example, rice, sugar, still highly valuable, highly profitable. It is true. But now there's the need to actually extract the kind of raw materials that are going to make possible the industrialization of their countries. Okay, so Europeans are beginning to now move into different areas of the world in order to extract those resources. They're not going to do that in the Americas, particularly because in the late 1700s and in the 1800s, the Americas, okay, are now the American colonies, are now moving towards independence, starting with the 13 British colonies of North America in 1776, declaring independence from Great Britain, and then the Spanish colonies to the south, and Mexico, Central and South America are also declaring independence from Spain. So we cover that, quite thoroughly. So at this time, the Europeans are losing their possessions in the Americas. So they're not going to extract those resources out of the American continent, but rather they're going to turn their attention elsewhere. They must look for colonies in other parts of the world. So there's an industrial revolution underway in Europe, starting in 1750 in England, and then, of course, spreading into the Western European countries I mentioned in the 1800s. And now the Europeans are trying to sustain their industries more than anything else. They're losing their plantations in the Americas, because those plantations were located in colonies that they had in America, but those colonies are declaring independence. So now they turn their attention to their now national industries now. They must secure the raw materials that are going to be necessary, vital to their industrial project. Okay, they must build industrial plants, steel plants. They must manufacturing plants, factories, and the like. They're building railroads as well. They're industrializing, so they must acquire raw materials, many of which are not found in their own countries. And so if you don't have the necessary materials in your own country to industrialize, you must step out and search for them elsewhere. Okay. And also because they're industrializing, they're also in need for markets. Okay. The consumers, that is to say, they're going to now manufacture products on such a massive scale that they're going to need to export those products at some point and make sure that their industries continue to operate and not oversaturate their own domestic market. And they must seize also foreign markets as well, consumers overseas, that is to say, willing to absorb their own manufactured products. So again, there's a different now setting again with the Industrial Revolution, because those in European countries are now in need again of things like coal, iron ore. They need zinc, those minerals, copper, lumber, rubber, and of course cotton. Again, cotton still something that has to be grown in plantations, of course, for clothing manufacturing. Still, but the vast majority again of the products that they must now extract from colonial territories, and they have to colonize, of course, areas in order to extract those resources, are resources that industries require. Coal is the fuel of the Industrial Revolution for smelting iron, for building railroads and iron works, etc. So they need also the iron ore, for the production of steel, etc. Again, zinc, copper, lumber, rubber, likewise, again, must be processed into finished products as well. So this is something that they require in order to fully industrialize. Now, so the Europeans then are beginning now to turn now their attention to other regions, okay, outside of America, in order to search for those materials. And it is precisely at the end of the 19th century, towards the latter decades, that the resources were located again in the continent of Africa. Okay, so now the Europeans are going to be moving into the continent of Africa and are beginning to divide that continent among themselves in order to establish different colonial territories there. In other words, to build European colonies again, that a certain European power is going to, extract the resources I just mentioned. That was the purpose of this process of colonization. So this process of dividing Africa among the Europeans was known during this time as the partition of Africa. The partition of Africa is the division of Africa by the European powers most of which were industrializing, so they were desperately in need, again, of those materials. So there were a series of meetings, again, by the European leaders in 1881, 1882. In those years, they were meeting in order to discuss, they were bringing about, again, they were discussing, for example, the maps of the continent of Africa in order to determine which European power was going to, seize which territories, and they were dividing, in other words, the continent by looking at different landmarks like rivers and mountain ridges, etc., that were going to be used to divide the colonies from between those European powers. So again, that was the intent, again, of those meetings, that by 1885, finally, the Europeans are now entering into the continent of Africa because they have already mapped out, again, their sphere of influence, and they're beginning now to colonize the continent, and they're beginning the process of the extraction, again, of those raw materials. Again, so this was considered a vital process, a vital strategy by the Europeans, due to the fact that, again, if they did not seize those raw materials, they were not going to fully industrialize. They were going to fall behind, again, and perhaps their neighbors in Europe were going to, be able to fully develop their economies, while they were going to simply lag behind, not being able to compete, again, with the leading industrial power. So they really wanted to compete. They really wanted to have competitive industries, factories, industrial plants. They wanted railroads and the like. They wanted to modernize. So it was necessary to move into this continent, again, to get those needed materials. So you can see in this map that it tells, again, the partition of Africa. This is a process that unfolded between 1885 to 1914. Okay, during this period of time, the Europeans are moving into the mainland, and they're beginning to now divide the continent and extract those materials. And so you can see, the area of green, again, that was the French region. There were a series of French colonial territories there. The area of red, where the British, again, established their colonial control. The Italians also established, colonial controls also in the north of Africa, etc. So what's very revealing, in order to understand the outbreak of World War One, is that the Germans, even though they obtained concessions here, they were given access to territories. They obtained just small territories. You can see the area here of brown, here in the west central coast, in South Africa, and also in the central east portion of Africa. So the Germans are going to feel in a certain sense, they're going to feel left out, even though they were not. They were given access. But compared to the other leading European powers like France and Great Britain, they felt that they were just given a small part of it, in other words. So the Germans felt that they needed to expand their colonial territories in Africa, acquire more territories for their growing industries. And one way to do that, of course, was competition. Okay, so you need to compete with the British and the French, particularly because they obtained the largest sections of Africa. So this is going to create a sense of competition, rivalry, particularly between the French and the British. I'm sorry, between the Germans and the British, and also the Germans and the French. The Germans see that both the French and the British needed to share more, and one way to do that, of course, was to seize those colonies, if you will, but through conflict, if you will. Okay, so that's what World War One also represented. It represented also colonial competition. Okay, what also the Europeans are going to be fighting for is particularly, again, competition. And of course, it's not just raw materials. I mentioned markets. What the Europeans are also concerned about is markets. You got industries, okay, and you got this technology that is now able to produce massive quantities of products quite fast. So there's also the need to export more if you want your economy to, to grow every year. It's essential that you export more, because that way your economy and your industries can continue producing products and selling products. Okay, it's not just producing them, it's also selling them. So if you don't have consumers at home, enough consumers, you can pursue consumers overseas. That's what a foreign market is. That's a foreign market. That's, again, foreign consumers. So again, we mentioned in the past, in the previous topic, about the open door policy in China. This is something that the Europeans have been pursuing in the 19th century. They're trying to open China's doors to the Europeans, so the Europeans can actually import in China, because China was considered the greatest market in the world, okay, in terms of consumers. Again, had the largest population in the world. There were, very few countries that came close to China at this point. Very few, like India, perhaps. But China was the largest, populated country in the world. So that entailed also the largest consumer base at the same time. So if you wanted to, export more and make sure you find consumers, China was considered that place. So the Europeans were in a struggle to compete for China's trade. In the 1860s, we see finally China opening up, signing a series of commercial treaties with the Europeans, known as the Treaty Ports, in which the Europeans were awarded or granted access to China's ports. The British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, and also the Japanese were granted access to China's market, and also access to a series of ports from which they were to import their manufactured goods. So we talked about, for example, in a previous topic, again, how the opening of China's doors led to the European powers coming in and controlling the port, controlling the trade of that port. And from that port, they started bringing their goods coming into China and pretty much selling those products inside of China as well. So once again, you have the area of red. This is the British zone, and the ports there are going to be controlled by the British. The area of green by France. The Germans were given a small area. Once again, okay, a small area, a small port from which to import their manufactured goods. But what they see is that their European counterparts, the French and the British, had been given large concessions there, more access to China's market, a larger region that they could use to sell their products. So they have a greater access to this market, that is to say. Okay, whereas the Germans felt that they have been, given very, very little. The Russians control the northern part of China, and the Japanese were, controlling, again, just the point that you see here in Korea, for example, that access to China's market. Okay, so the Germans felt they were in a disadvantaged position, okay, compared to the British and the French, and this is going to convince them that likewise, if the German economy if Germans, if the new nation of Germany that have been formed in 1871 was going to compete and not only survive but thrive, to compete and perhaps become the dominant European economy that they needed indeed to compete, to cease perhaps concessions from the French and the British, even in China. So this is what else also was at stake. The Germans felt that the war, the meaning of the war, was not just seizing more territories in Africa from their rivals, the French and the British, but also seizing more concessions in China to have a greater access to this, very great market. And they felt that the only way was, of course, competition, or in this case, conflict. This was the meaning of World War One. Again, that is European colonialism. Those are industrial powers now looking for colonies to provide the raw materials, markets, and this is what they were fighting for. In Germany, more than the other European powers, felt so compelled to compete for raw materials and markets, particularly markets, because more than any other group in Europe, the Germans actually lacked an internal market. Okay, so what this means is that Germany does not have a large consumer base at home. Okay, because a great portion of the German population, it is estimated that at least half of Germany's population, 50% of the people in Germany, are serfs. Okay, they're serfs, servants, or in more practical terms, this is the closest to what we know of a slave, a person that is enslaved, in other words. Okay, they're serfs. Has a very large serf population. Okay, and so the serfs, of course, are not in a wage labor economy. They're not being paid wages. They're not earning wages. That is to say, serfs are providing service through their labor to landowners. They're working for a landowner, really for free. I mean, they're being given sustenance, they're being given food, they're being given clothing, shelter, and the like, but they're not really earning any income. They're not earning any wages that will allow them to go out and buy products. Okay, so they're not participating in this consumer economy. They're not consumers because they're not earning wages. So this is one reason why Germany is going to feel so compelled to step outside of their own borders to seek foreign markets, and seek foreign markets in a very aggressive way, to the point that they deemed essential, vital, to compete with the French and the British for having a greater and greater access to China's trade, because their economies were not going to grow if they did not really export products overseas, because the German population is not really buying. 50% of the people in Germany are not buying the products manufactured by the German industries, so they must export those overseas. Okay, so this is why Germany is going to pursue a very aggressive foreign policy that entailed contemplating the need for conflict. In 1914, the Germans were so convinced that this was essential for national survival, by the way, that this was actually greatly needed for national survival. Just a second. And the reason why they're so compelled uh, to pursue this aggressive foreign policy is, as I said, is because they see this as a matter of national survival. Okay. And the reason for that is because they see that industry, okay, an industrial economy is really the lifeblood of the country as a whole. Okay, they see that the industrial revolution, the building of industrial plants, manufacturing plants, or um, factories and the like, that the industries in general are going to be the most important enterprise that is going to ensure the wealth of the German nation, ensure that there's wealth creation, that there's wealth accumulation. Okay, that this is the only this is the only way that Germany is going to acquire wealth, build wealth, that is to say, in order to sustain the nation as a whole. They see that because industries are like the lifeblood that is going to keep this organism alive. The organism is the nation. They see that, again, the German nation is like an organism. It's like an individual. It's like a living organism, whatever kind of organism it is, but it's a living organism. So therefore, they see that the nation has to compete for survival with the other nations as well. Okay, because nations are just like people. They're just like any other organism. It's just like any other creature of nature that is striving to survive. Again, this is the influence of evolution. Evolutionary theory, it's at its peak during this period of time, is gaining a lot of popularity. This is how people think about politics. They see that, there's a struggle for survival in society, that individuals are striving to survive. So they must strive, they must work very hard in order to survive. So therefore, also they see nations in the same process, that nations are just like people that must also compete for their own survival. And of course, those that do not compete and that are not dominant, those that fall behind, that are weak, nature will select them to die off, the process of natural selection. That they will be selected to become extinct, in other words, because they're weak. But if they're going to survive, if they're going to have any chance for survival, therefore they must prove to be dominant. They must prove that they're the dominant, they're the survival of the fittest, in other words. Okay, so this idea of the survival of the fittest convinced the peoples of Europe, particularly the Germans, but again, everybody's under this influence, the scientific idea that it is essential to compete, that is natural to compete. For what? For raw materials and markets. If it's necessary to compete for colonies, that will provide the nation the essential materials for industries, because industries is the lifeblood of the country. Is the lifeblood of the national economy that sustains the national economy. It builds wealth, etc. It provides jobs for people and the like. So if we're going to have jobs, if we're going to have wealth, if we're going to build a middle class, we must do everything to sustain our industry. So again, we need to compete. We need to be very decisive, be very strong. And we have to compete for those colonies because they're going to provide the needed materials, or we need to compete for ports or access to markets like China, for example, because this is going to ensure the continuity of industrial production and industrial jobs. Okay. And the more we export, the more jobs that are going to be created. So the nation survives. Okay. So it's survival of the fittest. So during this period of time, once we look into the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, this became like a religious idea, survival of the fittest in Europe. That is to say, to the point that what we're going to see also in Europe, that this idea of survival of the fittest gave rise also to the idea that the strongest organism that dominates in nature, for example, when you look at the animal kingdom, who is the survival of the fittest? Well, those that dominate, okay? Like the lion, for example. The lion is the king, okay? In the world of nature, for example, it's just an example. But the lion that actually is in charge of the jungle that dominate is the male, okay? It is the male that actually is the one that exerts its influence, its domination upon the other species. Again, so this gave rise also in Europe to the idea of the alpha male, that if you were to be the survival of the fittest, you need to be the alpha male, the dominant one, like machismo. This has led to an excessive obsession with male domination, male energy, male dominated politics. In other words, that the males were going to be the ones leading the nation in the future towards, survival and domination. That to be a man, again, was to be competitive, to be decisive, and to be courageous, and to prove, that you were dominant in the battlefield, because only the alpha male, only those that are the leaders, the males, are going to dominate politics. And as we moved into the 20th century, Europeans felt that, yeah, this is the way. This is the way that we have to do politics. This is the way we create policy, okay? Is always look at, again, a kind of male-dominated world. We need to exert our, influence upon other nations, be very courageous, and like very macho, in other words. And you need to be very brave, very courageous, and don't be intimidated, by your rivals. Again, that if they threaten you or challenge you, you have to respond like a male, in other words, and be dominant. In other words, the alpha male drive. So again, this led to a problem with machismo, again, in Europe, that is going to also affect European politics, because Europeans felt that this is the way to do politics. And even war was seen in that fashion, that, again, you're not going to be timid. You're not going to back down in terms of, and when you're being challenged, that you have to be dominant, in other words. So again, this kind of created the conditions for the type of competition we're going to see in World War One, in which the nations felt that this is the way nature works. We're doing just what nature is doing in the animal kingdom, okay? Going to war is not something wrong. It's natural, because it is about the survival of the fittest, and only the male, again, are the ones that dominate and are able to survive in the environment. So we're just acting out according to natural law. Okay, they saw war as part as natural law, the law of nature, the survival of the fittest, and they're competing, of course, with, for the most essential, again, products that are going to sustain their economies. And of course, it is Germany that is going to, more than the others. This is not really saying that only Germany. The German people felt this way. Even the British, the French, and all the others felt the same way. But Germany is the one that is now challenging the dominant powers in Europe that have dominated European politics for centuries, the British and the French, but more so the British, because the British were dominant during this time. So the Germans felt that they needed then to compete with the dominant party, the British. They needed to compete with them in every level, at every level, in every area of national life, in terms of who was going to be dominant in the world of technology. Okay, well, if the British are investing a lot in technology, we're also going to invest also, okay, in technological development. Who is going to have the most advanced technology, the most advanced science? The Germans were also investing heavily in scientific research, scientific development, investing resources, again, to create a scientific community. as well. So much so that when you look at the 20th century, Albert Einstein actually came from Germany, okay, from the German scientific community, by the way. He left, of course, Germany in the early 1930s, but, nonetheless, he's coming out of this environment, okay? And also, they were competing for industrial supremacy, which nation was going to be the leader of industry, the largest industrial base, the largest manufacturing base, and the like. Yeah, this is what the Germans felt compelled to do based on the ideas I just explained about Darwinian evolution, the survival of the fittest. And so this led then to a competition that was very evident between those two countries, Germany and Great Britain, in which both distrust each other. Again, because they were rivals, they were competing as to who was going to be the leader of Europe, to the point that they both were preparing for conflict because they really wanted to deter the other from, initiating conflict, initiating war, in terms of building an arsenal, in an arms race, building weapons and ships, etc., because they really wanted to defend themselves from one another. So, in a sense, again, from 1871 to 1914, both countries began to build an arsenal that was used to deter the other from attacking you. But in the end, in 1914, this arsenal will be actually used again to, wage war against each other. So again, it kind of, had the contrary effect again in the end. Now the third leading factor for World War One. So we covered two already: ethnic nationalism, European colonialism. The third leading factor that led to the First World War was the system of alliances. Okay, what's called the alliance system. This is another leading factor that most historians that deal with this period of time actually identify as central to the outbreak of World War One. And again, we're going to see the rise of alliances again, an alliance system, countries coming together in order to defend themselves or provide assistance to one another in case the certain nations of Europe will decide to initiate conflict. That is to say, it will better to build an alliance, to be part of a group, to have a greater chance for survival or actually winning a particular conflict that might emerge, than if you were just by yourself. In other words, it was kind of like human nature to do that, by the way. So alliances, of course, in Europe were not something new. That was barely taking place around this time prior to World War One. The system of alliances in and of themselves were not new. And as a matter of fact, they have been central to the way the Europeans for many, many centuries maintained a balance of power, okay, in Europe. This was a tradition, okay, in European history, that we have always seen system of alliances, shifting alliances, people forming alliances, and we always see those because when you study European politics, European history, there was a kind of an understanding again among the European leaders that there should never be a single European kingdom that will dominate all of Europe. Okay, so that was the understanding. Again, that no single ruler, no single monarch, no single kingdom was going to dominate all of Europe. Okay, that it was necessary to maintain the sovereignty of the different kingdoms, the different regions, and the different leaders, etc. So for that purpose, then alliances were highly useful in maintaining what is called a balance of power. A balance of power that whenever one king or one monarch or one kingdom was growing, excessively in terms of influence and power, what the Europeans were to do in that situation to maintain the balance of power is that the smaller kingdoms, the smaller countries will simply come together in order to form a counterbalance to the growing influence of this king, if you will, in order to maintain the balance of power. Again, so whenever one party, one nation, one kingdom was growing excessively, the other smaller kingdoms will simply get together in order to deter this kingdom from expanding any further. So we're seeing as something healthy, if you will, to maintain the balance of power. So there was nothing wrong with that. As we'll see, it was really the way it was built, the alliances, that is going to be problematic, leading to World War One. Okay, so before we get to that point, let us look at the alliances that were built. Okay, before 1914, we're going to see, in this case, Great Britain and France, now coming together as allies after being rivals in the past. The French and the British have been fighting ever since the late 1600s. Again, a series of wars, colonial wars, trade wars, some of which were fought in Europe and others were fought overseas, etc. They have been rivals, the French and the British. But now, in the 19th century, with the unification of Germany, the French and the British now have a new kid in the block, so to speak. Okay, the Germans. They're now unified, and they pose a significant threat to their influence in Europe. Okay, and so now it's time to unify. The French and the British are going to set their past rivalries aside and instead come together and build an alliance in order to counter the growing influence of Germany. Germany at this point is not only unified but has ambitions again, imperial ambitions, and they're now rivaling the power, the leadership of France and Britain. And so they're going to bring along the alliance Russia. Russia is also a very important party here that is not necessarily a democracy, even though France and Great Britain are democracies. Russia is going to be brought in order to encircle Germany on both fronts. Okay, so this is the German Empire. Okay, this is Great Britain. This is France. So they're going to come together now, and they're going to bring now Russia to the east. So the German empire will be encircled on two fronts: in the east, confronted by Russia, and to the west by France and Great Britain. And again, this is going to force the German army to split in half in case there's war, that one division will be fighting in the east against Russia and the other ones against the west. So that was, again, a strategic alliance. And of course, Germany is also going to form their own alliance with another empire called the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And they're also going to bring a non-European party, the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish Empire in the Middle East is going to come along with the Germans, again, to form what is called the Central Powers. Okay, those are the two alliances. Now, what we're going to see here is that and this is the Ottoman Empire. You can see here in the Middle East, it's called the Turkish Empire, will be now joining the Austrian-Hungarians and the Germans. So we have a quote-unquote balance of power in Europe, a system of alliances that is going to maintain a balance. That was the idea. But it was the way those alliances were built that was problematic. Okay, because in the system of alliances, what it was written there, again, it was that in those treaties when you join the alliance is that in both alliances, the Allies and the Central Powers, it was clearly stipulated that if you join the alliance, therefore, you have to abide by certain conditions, you have certain obligations to the other members of the alliance, in that if any of the members go to war, okay, because there's a country that declared war on them, that means you have to join, okay, that war. Because that declaration of war to a single country was a declaration of war to all the other members of the alliance. So it really made, the participation of all the parties that were the members of the alliance inevitable to move towards the battlefield, because everybody has to participate. You're bound to help, your fellow members, because they're also declaring war on you. Even though this country, X, declare war on you, a member of your alliance, it's a declaration of all on all. So everybody has to participate. So it made war inevitable. That is to say, because it just required one country declaring war from one alliance to the other for the entire war to set off again, in which all the parties will participate. And also, in those treaties, it was also stipulated that the victors, again, if in case there will be war, that those that win, again, the victors have the right to seize colonies from the defeated alliance, that you were entitled to seize colonial territories or ports, etc., kind of pick and choose, if you will, from the defeated alliance. So there was an incentive there to participate, because on one hand, you have an obligation to participate, but also that there's an incentive, there's a material reward that if you participate, if you win, you can seize, of course, materials, concessions, territories, again, from the defeated alliance as well. So again, the system of alliances is going to be critical, in bringing about, World War I. The fourth leading cause for World War I is deals with problems that emerged in a region in Eastern Europe called the Balkans. This is a region in which the European powers will be drawn there, and to the point that they're going to clash, and it is in this particular region where World War I is going to ignite. This was seen as the powder keg of Europe. The Balkans, again, is a region of southeastern Europe that will be highly contested by the European powers, because it was geographically located in a corridor, in a hall, if you will, and that connected, in terms of trade, Europe with Asia and also Africa as well. Okay, so goods coming from Asia, coming from India, coming from China, coming from the Middle East, and from Africa, from North Africa, or from the continent of Africa, that were moving into Europe per se, had to cross this region. So it was the geographical significance of the Balkans that will be so significant for the Europeans that they're going to now move very decisively, and they're going to contest. They're trying to build a series, again, of provinces or territories or colonies that will be part of their imperial systems. In other words, they're trying to colonize it. Okay, they're trying to build colonies there, in order to control this region because of the trade, etc. And this is going to lead to, the spark of World War I. And there were two, particularly, there were two European powers. There were members of the different alliances that are going to be drawn into this region. One was Russia, as a member of the Allies, and the other one is Austria-Hungary, a member of the Central Powers. Why? Why are they so interested, particularly those two, in the Balkans? Again, this is, the region that we call the Balkans right here. You can see all of this region in Eastern Europe. This is known as the Balkans. This is where World War One is going to ignite. The reason is because both Russia and Austria-Hungary lacked ports for international trade. They don't have access necessarily to overseas trade because they just don't have a port. And so they see that this location offers access precisely for having some form of access for the exports and imports of products, imports that the product that they want to bring in from abroad, from the Far East, from the Middle East, from Africa. This is an entry point that they need, of course, and also an exit point as well. Something that they want to export can be exported through this port, through these regions again. So they want to colonize, again, the Balkans in order to have access for this trade, for international trade, because of the ports that it offers. Of course, in Austria-Hungary is beginning to expand their colonial control in the Balkans as early as 1878, when it actually turned a little province called Bosnia into a colony. Okay, so it annexed Bosnia as a colony of Austria-Hungary in 1878, and they're now using Bosnia as a way to, introduce products, raw materials, particularly that Austria-Hungary needed for their own economy. So they're beginning to, move into this region by colonizing certain segments little by little. They're extending their control. Russia, on the other hand, is not necessarily directly building colonies, but Russia is promoting the independence of groups that are actually colonized by Austria-Hungary. So Russia is supporting the independence of Bosnia, particularly, and it wants to create a grand nation, the Serbian nation, the nation of Serbia. Okay, it wants to unify all of the peoples of the Balkans that belong to the Slavic ethnic group, the Slavs. In this case, the Slavic peoples that, ethnically speaking, are connected to the Russian people. The Russians are Slavs. They're Slavic. So Russia is saying, hey, ethnicity and self-determination. We have the Slavic peoples here that want independence. They deserve the right to create their own independent state. And let's, grant them their independence so they can live under a nation called Serbia. So initially what Russia wants is to unify all the Slavic peoples there under the Serbian nation, and later on pretty much annex Serbia into the Russian Empire and pretty much control this region in that way. So we got one party pretty much colonizing it, the Austrian-Hungarians, and the other one is promoting independence, okay, the independence of the peoples that live there. So again, what we see is that the emperor of Austria-Hungary was getting quite old, Joseph II, and is looking for an heir to the throne. Okay, he wants to actually select the prince that is going to succeed him after death, so he can continue the empire. And so this is going to lead to the problems again, igniting World War One, because when Joseph II begins to select the heir to the throne, the peoples of Bosnia expected that the new ruler, Archduke Ferdinand, again, that was the name of the nephew of Joseph II, was going to actually grant them independence. That they said, yeah, so Joseph II is about to die, but the new ruler, he's young, he's going to be more modern in his thinking, and he's going to actually grant us independence. But when they learned that Archduke Ferdinand was simply going to continue the same old policy of imperial control of Bosnia, they were so crushed that they decided that the only way to gain independence was if Archduke Ferdinand, did not succeed, to the throne. That, in other words, that if something happened to him, like if he will die or something like that. Okay, so that's exactly what happened when Archduke Ferdinand was sent on a mission to travel to all of the colonies of Austria-Hungary to visit them, like in a parade, to cheer the people so he can be exhibited as the new ruler. When he arrived again to Bosnia, he will be there in the streets, pretty much assassinated in 1914 by a gunman coming from Serbia, a Serbian nationalist from the neighboring country of Serbia. Again, that it wants independence for Bosnia. It wants Bosnia to become independent, to join Serbia. Again, his name was Gavrilo Princip. Again, he goes into the parade in the middle of the street, pretty much assassinates the Archduke. This is the nephew of Joseph II. And this is going to set off, again, the conditions for the war. Again, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Because when Gavrilo Princip was arrested, it was revealed that he was coming from Serbia, that he was Serbian, in other words. So this is something that the country of Serbia did in order to, pretty much move Bosnia towards independence, assassinate the heir to the throne of the empire. So, of course, the Austrian-Hungarians, Joseph II and the ministers that were counseling him decided to issue an ultimatum to Serbia. Okay, so Austria-Hungary decided to give, in other words, a list of demands. That's what an ultimatum is, a list of demands to the country of Serbia, for the country of Serbia to collaborate, to cooperate with Austria-Hungary in pretty much doing away with all of the propaganda, all of the revolutionary propaganda that Bosnia was engaged in. There were a series of newspapers, there were journalists that were promoting revolution and independence, and it wanted the government of Serbia to suppress all of those newspapers, to stop all of this propaganda. But the last demand, okay, in that series of demands was the demand to arrest the Serbian officials who actually collaborated with Gavrilo Princip. In other words, we want you to find out who were the officials who sent Gavrilo Princip to assassinate the Archduke. And this demand was not complied with. Okay, the government of Serbia failed to comply. It was only given a couple of days, again, to comply, and they decide that they were not going to comply with the ultimatum. They're not going to turn in those officials. So that was an action that revealed complicity, in other words. So therefore, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, okay? And it's just declaring war on this small nation called Serbia that Russia is backing up, by the way. Russia is pretty much backing up Serbia. And in order to defend Serbia, okay, Russia is beginning to mobilize the army, moving the army to the south, to the Balkans, to prevent Austria-Hungary from colonizing Serbia, because Russia just feels that Austria-Hungary was simply expanding the empire in this region. First Bosnia, now Serbia. They're beginning to expand their colonial control. So Russia is now trying to protect Serbia, preventing the colonization of this little country. And it is here that Germany makes a grave mistake, a fatal one, by the way, in that the German Emperor Wilhelm II decides to declare war on Russia. Okay, there was no need, okay, to declare war again on Russia. Because Russia is not sending troops to Germany. They're just trying to defend Serbia. But Germany feels that this has to be done. In other words, like this is the alpha male drive. We need to be the ones that are dominant. In other words, demonstrate that we're decisive and that we're going to declare war on Russia. They felt Russia was ill prepared, was weak, that it was not going to be able to fight and win the war against Germany. So they said, let's just get it over with. Let's declare war. And this is a great mistake, because what that did was that by declaring war on Russia, it started World War One, because this was a declaration of war against France and Great Britain simultaneously, and everybody had to jump in at that point. All the parties now will have to participate, and again, it made war quite inevitable at this point. Okay, so again, this is the beginning stages now of World War One. And so the Great War begins. This is the name of this war by the people who lived in this time. Okay, it's called the Great War. From 1914, it officially ended in 1918, even though there was still conflict, extending into 1919, by the way. Okay. So at any rate, so it was during this time quite evident for the peoples of Europe what was at stake. In other words, what the war meant. Why the war? In other words, when people rushed to the battlefield and Wilhelm II declared war on Russia, and we're going to see the leaders in Russia, the leaders in France and Great Britain trying to mobilize again their own troops, they're going to use ethnic nationalism. In other words, that's very important. Ethnic nationalism. We have to go to the battlefield because we're going to defend the nation, our group, etc., our heritage. And of course, people felt that this was also a Darwinian struggle for survival as well. Who is going to be dominant? This is the survival of the fittest, in other words. So yes, there's all of those ideas, again, present in the minds of the people. Machismo, the alpha male, etc., all of that. But they understood that there were practical objectives to meet, to accomplish, to fulfill. And that is, again, that they also interpreted this conflict as a conflict to seize territories in Africa. Now, that what really in the competition was about is Africa, China, the trade, and the Balkans. Who's going to control the Balkans, in other words? Okay, there are three specific regions, that is to say, that they were going to dispute, they were going to actually fight for, they were going to, rival, in the battlefield. They were going to go to the battlefield to decide who was going to be dominant in terms of controlling the resources of Africa, the trade in China, etc., and the Balkans as well. Okay, and also the peoples around the world also thought in this way. The people who were informed, who read newspapers, who were up to date, if you will, with politics and the news, etc. Yeah, they also understood that this was a European conflict first and foremost. Again, so there was no doubt about that. And a lot of people didn't really give it a thought that, there was something new about this, because, if you study European history, for many, many centuries in the past, this was business as usual, that this, is very, very, very expected that you will see from time to time warfare taking place in Europe. And this is, again, part of European history. Okay, in certain decades they might be peace, but at some point the Europeans are going to engage in conflict. So people did not really give it a thought as to, there's something new here, that this is so different, etc. It was business as usual. This is another European conflict that is going to span for a few years, and Europeans are going to end it with a treaty, etc. However, the Europeans themselves who were engaged in this war, in the very first weeks and months of the war, they woke up to a different reality that they did not anticipate that this was going to be the kind of warfare, the kind of experience that they were accustomed to, that they read about or that they knew about, that there was something new in this kind of warfare, that warfare has changed because there was, all of the rules of the past, the way people conducted warfare in Europe did not apply here. Okay, none of the rules of the past. Okay, so what we see here is that we get new technology. Okay, new military weapon technology, new weaponry that was very sophisticated that was not used in the past. Okay, this is the first time we're going to see, for example, machine guns, for example. Okay, machine guns, tanks, for example, barbed wire, mustard gas, pepper gas, and the like. Something new, landmines and the like. So there was something new. There was a new technology being used that is going to give rise to a new kind of warfare. Okay, new kind of warfare. So this is what the Europeans are going to wake up to this realization that something has changed. They're witnessing that they can no longer face, the enemy in formations like people did in the past. There were formations of like a certain division facing another, walking, some steps forward, shooting each other, reloading. It takes about 30 seconds or a minute to reload and then firing again. That all of that was a thing of the past because now you have machine guns firing shots about 7 rounds per second. Okay, quite fast, and you're not going to stand in front of the enemy line in order to prove yourself that you're a gentleman and that you're following the rules of warfare, because there's no rules. Because the machines are not thinking, anymore. They're just being operated, and they just, again, unleash, of course, raining fire on the other side. So people are trying to pretty much, cover themselves and escape the raining fire of the machine guns. So this is what, again, the Europeans are waking up to, that they're now in the machine age. We're living in the age of the machines now. Okay, this is what they're realizing, that now we got machinery that is very sophisticated, that is very efficient in carrying out, tasks that previously were carried out by hand, or were carried out by machines that were not very innovative, they were not very effective. So now we're living in the industrial age, in the age of the machines, that the machines are now doing the work that human beings did in the past much faster, much more efficiently, and we're now living in the age of mass production. So all of that is now experienced in warfare. Again, machines are doing the task of warfare far more efficient, and now we're, experiencing, of course, mass production as well in terms of casualties, mass production. So much so, again, that the British Army, the entire original British Army, will be gone in only a year and a half. The entire British Army, very quickly. So again, this is something new. There's a new nature, a new character, again, that we see in warfare. And again, what is going to be so characteristic, again, of World War One is that soldiers were trying to hide from the bullets because they were, being fired so rapidly that it was necessary to cover yourself, and they dig ditches that became known as trenches. This is very, very characteristic of World War One and World War Two, but particularly World War One. The trenches, the soldiers building trenches, hiding from the raining, bullets that were shot at them by the enemy lines. And again, what we see is that this is the kind of warfare, again, of the 20th century. It's called trench warfare. Okay, you can see this in this depiction in this picture. Again, and most of the trenches will be built. They will be, of course, built in several places of Europe, but the largest trenches in which most of the battles are going to be fought in Europe were trenches built in the northern border between France and Germany. Okay, the Germans are invading, of course, France, and the French are trying to stop the German advance by building trenches there and trying to hold the Germans as much as possible. And most of World War One, again, most of the battles were fought here. So the Germans are also fighting, of course, in the east against Russia, but Russia will fall rather quickly by 1917. So the Germans are going to concentrate most of their energies, most of their efforts in trying to subdue the French by trying to push those trenches, southern south, to this line, and they were not going to advance very much. It would be about maybe 15 or 20 miles again that were actually moving back and forth. That the French are going to push the Germans to the north 15 miles, and then later on the Germans will push them 15 miles to the south. Again, so this is something new, again, that is going to be so characteristic, again, of World War One. Okay, so up to this point, we have reached our time. The only thing I want to mention at this point as an afterthought here, just going back to this machine age and trench warfare, is that this kind of warfare called, trench warfare, and the experiences of, again, that the soldiers had now with the more sophisticated technology, the machinery, is going to leave a mark, not only on this generation, but is going to leave a mark on the peoples that lived in the 20th century and beyond. That now people sense now that they're not necessarily, when we experience something called warfare, is that we're not necessarily, fighting another human being, even though you are, in essence, you're fighting another, human being. But you're confronting now machines in the process. Okay, so the mark that will be felt or will be left on the 20th century, and particularly starting with World War One, is the sense, is the experience that we're now fighting machines. In other words, that whenever we won't go to war, is that you're battling the machines, and the machines are, of course, being operated by people, and they just do the work that people are, intending to do. But again, it is the machine that is becoming now the enemy, if you will. Okay, and again, this is going to be an issue, an idea that is going to be projected in popular culture, in novels, in comics, in movies. For example, when you see the rise of the film industry, we're going to see films. And when you look at the 20th century, we're going to see films that talk about this issue, the issue of the machines, that machines are taking a life of their own, that humans at one point in the future will be fighting the machines. Again, we see that with like Terminator, for example, the Terminator movies, for example, The Matrix. Okay, another, kind of movie that talks about that. It's a dystopian future in which the machines acquire an intelligence of their own, they take a life of their own, and they now go against the humans, in other words. So this is just a subconscious concern, a subconscious fear that we're creating machines that are the ones responsible for the high level of destruction that is produced whenever we produce something like warfare, for example. So it is being projected again in the popular imagination, for example, in how we envision the future. When we see a movie, that is a writer that is dreaming about the future, is preoccupied, is concerned that this is where humanity is going. Right? Like the Terminator movies I just mentioned, or Matrix, where the machines take over and they're the ones subduing humans and the like. And this is something, again, that arises particularly from this experience starting in World War One, and it will continue again to occur in World War II and beyond, across the 20th century. This is going to be the sense. This is going to be the preoccupation again of the people living in the 20th century. We're living in the machine age, and again, people are now battling the machine. We're confronting the machines and the like. Okay, so that's all I have for you up to this point. In session 3, we're going to cover U.S. entry into the war. We're going to look at the reasons, that led the United States to come into the war quite, in a late stage, 1917. We're going to look at the end of World War One, and we're going to look at the aftermath as well. Looking at the aftermath, if you will, what actually the war changed in the world at large. Okay, so again, this is the end of session 2. We'll continue our discussion, the remaining portions in session 3 when we come back. Okay, thank you.